"Don't go to the East Wing," the girl whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Someone's been in there. Someone who doesn't work here." Bernard Holloway turned and looked at her. She was maybe 9, 10 at most. The daughter of one of his groundskeepers, he thought, though he couldn't place her name. She had dirt on her knees and was holding a half-eaten apple like she'd forgotten it was there. "What did you say?" he asked. She didn't repeat herself. She just stared at him with those serious brown eyes and said, "Please, Mr. Holloway, don't go." He almost laughed. He almost patted her on the head and walked away. He'd been walking that path to the East Wing every morning for 11 years, ever since his wife had converted the old carriage house into her painting studio. It was the first thing he did each morning before the staff arrived, before the phone started ringing, before the day swallowed him whole. He brought coffee, 2 cups. She always forgot to eat before noon. He almost laughed. But something about the way she stood there stopped him. Bernard Holloway had built Holloway Logistics from a single warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, into one of the largest freight distribution networks in the Midwest. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had aged into authority rather than softness. He had testified before a Senate subcommittee on infrastructure. He had been photographed shaking hands with 2 sitting governors. He had negotiated contracts worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He was not accustomed to being stopped by a child holding an apple. But he stopped. "What's your name?" he asked. "June," she said. "June Alderman. My daddy does the irrigation on the North Field." Bernard nodded slowly. He knew Alderman. Good man, quiet, had been with the property for 4 years. June must have been running loose on the grounds again while her father worked. Bernard had seen her before, chasing the barn cats along the fence line, but they'd never spoken more than hello. "What did you see, June?" She bit her lip. "I wasn't supposed to be over there. I know that. But I was looking for Biscuit. He's the orange one. And I went around behind the studio through the gap in the boxwoods, and there was a truck. A dark gray truck with no markings. And a man. He wasn't in a uniform or anything. He was talking on his phone, and he kept looking at the side door." She paused. "The door you use. The one with the keypad." Bernard kept his voice even. "What did the man look like?" "Tall, younger than you. Dark jacket. He had a tattoo on his hand, on the part between his thumb and finger. She made a V with her own small fingers to show him where. How long ago was this?" "Maybe 20 minutes. I came to find you right away, but they said you were on a call." Bernard looked toward the East Wing. The path curved through a stand of old oaks, and you couldn't see the carriage house from here, which meant whoever was there couldn't see them either. He thought about his wife, Sylvia. She went to the studio at 6:30 every morning without fail. It was 7:30 now. He pulled out his phone. Called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Sylvia Holloway was 58. And had the kind of quiet beauty that photographs never quite captured. She had grown up in Savannah, the daughter of a high school art teacher, and she had never fully adjusted to the scale of the life she'd married into. She didn't like events. She didn't like being introduced as Bernard's wife at Gallus, where she wasn't sure what she was supposed to say afterward. But she loved that studio. She'd painted in it nearly every morning for a decade, and Bernard loved that she had it. He'd converted it for her on their 20th anniversary, and she always answered her phone before 8. He called again. Voicemail. He looked at June. "Is there still a way through those boxwoods?" She nodded. "Show me." Quietly. They went around the back of the garden rather than up the main path. June moved through the hedge gap easily. Bernard had to turn sideways and duck, and a branch caught his collar, but he didn't make a sound. They came around the far side of the studio where there was a strip of gravel between the building and the fence, hidden from both the main house and the driveway. The gray truck was still there. It was parked at an angle, partially behind an overgrown laurel. The engine was off. Bernard could see the side door of the studio from where he stood. The keypad door, the one he and Sylvia used when they came this way from the garden. The door was slightly ajar. It was never left ajar. He put his hand on June's shoulder and moved her gently back behind the boxwoods. He pointed at the main house and raised his eyebrows. She understood. She went quick and silent, back the way they'd come, but pressed himself against the building's stone exterior and listened. He heard voices, 2 of them inside. One was Sylvia's. She sounded controlled the way she got when she was upset and trying not to show it. The other voice was male and low, and Bernard had to concentrate to make out the words. "Told you it would be today. I'm not waiting any longer. The account numbers, Sylvia. That's all. I don't have access to those. I've told you that. You're his wife. I'm his wife, not his accountant. Those accounts are held under the company structure, not personally. I can't. Don't." A long silence. Then the male voice again, quieter, which somehow made it worse. "You brought me into this. You said this would be simple. You said he'd never look twice at a wire transfer if you initiated it from the household account. Now you're telling me the household account won't cover it." Bernard stood very still. He had been married to Sylvia for 31 years. He had held her hand in 2 hospital rooms. He had watched her cry at sunsets for reasons she couldn't explain. He had never, in all of that time, had reason to doubt her. He stood in the strip of gravel beside the building he had converted for her, and he listened to her voice, and he understood slowly and completely that something had been happening that he hadn't known about, that she had made arrangements he hadn't known about, that there was a man in her studio who was not there by accident and who had not arrived today for the first time. His first instinct was to open that door. He didn't. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 4 decades making decisions under pressure, and the one thing he knew with absolute certainty was that walking through that door right now would be the worst decision he could make. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't know what this arrangement was, or how far it had progressed, or who else was involved. All he knew was what he'd heard in the last 90 seconds, and 90 seconds was not enough. He stepped back from the wall. He walked very calmly back through the boxwood gap and around the garden and into the main house through the kitchen entrance. June was standing in the kitchen with Margaret, the housekeeper, who was making coffee and looking at the girl with the polite bewilderment of someone who wasn't sure if she was supposed to offer juice. Bernard looked at June. "You did the right thing," he said. "Go find your dad. Don't mention the truck to anyone else." She nodded once, gravely, and left. Margaret started to say something. Bernard said, "I need the kitchen to myself for a few minutes," and she went without question, because in 11 years she had learned what that voice meant. He sat at the kitchen table and thought. The man's name, Bernard, over the next 4 days was Preston Caulfield. He had run a mid-size real estate investment firm in Atlanta for 6 years before it collapsed in a tangle of mismanaged funds and deferred debt. No criminal charges had been filed, but Bernard's attorney found 3 civil suits that had been settled quietly, and an SEC inquiry that had gone nowhere when the primary complainant withdrew. Caulfield was 41. He had been living in Cincinnati for the past 8 months, which meant he had been living 40 minutes from this house. Bernard found this out by saying nothing and watching everything. He did not confront Sylvia. He did not change his behavior. He brought coffee to the studio the next morning as he always did, and she smiled at him from behind her easel, and he smiled back, and he sat with her for 11 minutes, talking about whether the hydrangeas along the south wall needed to be cut back, and she said she thought so, and he said he'd ask Alderman to take a look. He brought coffee the morning after that, and the morning after that. He hired a private investigator on the second day. Not someone local, someone from out of state, someone his attorney vouched for personally, and whose discretion was unimpeachable. He told the investigator only what was necessary. What came back over the following week was this. Sylvia had opened a secondary account 16 months ago under a family trust that Bernard had co-signed years earlier, and largely forgotten about. The trust had dormant authorization that, technically, allowed either party to open sub-accounts without dual approval, a loophole in old paperwork that had never been closed because no one had ever thought to close it. She had been moving money into it in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. The total, as of the investigator's last report, was just under $400,000. Preston Caulfield had a history with Sylvia that predated Bernard by 2 years. They had met in Savannah. They had lost touch. They had found each other again. The investigator was delicate about how he phrased this approximately 19 months ago. Bernard read the report in his office with the door closed. He sat with it for a long time. He thought about the morning June. Alderman had stopped him on the garden path with dirt on her knees and an apple in her hand. He thought about how close he had come to laughing. Do that. He thought about what would have happened if he had walked through that studio door, what Caulfield might have done, what story might have been told afterward, how the narrative of a 63-year-old man's death might have been shaped by the people who stood to benefit from it. He had no proof that anything beyond financial fraud had been intended. But he thought about Caulfield's voice. He didn't know yet. He needed to know. He called his attorney. Then he called his accountant. Then he called a man he knew at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, whom he had met at a government infrastructure conference 3 years ago and stayed in contact with. He made himself another cup of coffee. He thought about Sylvia's face in the studio, the ease of her smile, the way she'd held her brush with paint already on her fingers at 8 in the morning. 31 years. He sat with the weight of that, and he let himself feel it fully, because he believed it was important to feel it rather than push it away. He was allowed to grieve something, even while he was protecting himself from it. Then he picked up his phone and kept working. The FBI moved on a Thursday. They came in the morning. which Bernard had been told to expect. He was in the main house when they arrived, and he watched from the upper landing as his attorney met them at the door. He had agreed to remain uninvolved in the physical execution of it. That had been difficult to accept, but he had accepted it. Sylvia was brought out of the East Wing by 2 agents. She was not in handcuffs, not at first. She was wearing the blue linen shirt she wore when she painted, and she had cadmium yellow on her left forearm. She looked across the drive toward the house, and Bernard was standing far enough back from the window that she couldn't see him, but she looked anyway. The way people look toward things they know are there. Preston Caulfield was picked up at his apartment in Cincinnati at approximately the same time. Bernard did not watch the car pull away. He went to the kitchen and drank his coffee and listened to the house, which was very quiet. Margaret had been given the day off. Alderman was on the north field. The barn cats were wherever barn cats go when the world becomes too still. Bernard's attorney told him later that the financial fraud case was, in his estimation, straightforward. The sub-account, the transfers, Caulfield's prior history. It formed a clear picture. The question of what else had been planned was less clear and would take longer to determine. There were text messages being examined. There were phone records. There was a conversation, apparently, that had taken place in the studio 6 weeks before June. Alderman had found a gray truck parked beside the boxwoods, and what that conversation contained was still being evaluated. Bernard said he understood. He did not ask for details. He had learned at 63 that there were some things you could know completely, and some things you could only know enough of, and that wisdom was understanding the difference. He found June 3 days later, on a Saturday, when he was walking the property in the late afternoon. She was at the fence line near the old barn, crouched down looking at something in the grass. He walked over and crouched beside her. There was a small garter snake moving through the clover, unhurried and unconcerned. "That's Biscuit's territory," she said, nodding at the snake. "He doesn't know that, though. Where's Biscuit now? On the tractor. Daddy lets him ride if he sits still." Bernard watched the snake for a moment. "June," he said, "I want you to know that what you did mattered. What you told me. It made a difference." She looked at him sideways. She had clearly decided at some point to be matter-of-fact about the whole thing. "Is it over?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "My dad says you should always say something when something's wrong. Even if you're scared. Your dad's a smart man." "I know." She paused. "Is the lady okay?" Bernard took a moment before answering. "She'll go through some difficult things," he said. "But the people who were hurt are going to be okay." June seemed to consider this. "Good," she said simply. She went back to watching the snake. Bernard stayed a little longer, crouching beside her in the low afternoon light, watching the small green snake move through the clover without hurrying, without looking back. After a while he stood, and he felt his knees and his age, and the strange, surviving weight of the week, and he walked back toward the house in the long shadows of the oaks, thinking about nothing in particular, which was something he had not been able to do in a very long time. The hydrangeas along the south wall, he noticed, had already been cut back. Alderman had taken care of it without being asked.